They called him a liability. To the parents walking the pristine halls of Oak Creek Elementary, Arthur was just a clumsy stain on the scenery. An old janitor whose hands shook so violently he couldn't even change a light bulb without shattering it. To Braden Hayes, the ambitious new director, Arthur was something worse. A drunkard, a safety hazard, a problem to be discarded. They watched him drop his tools. They watched him struggle to button his own shirt. They whispered about how sad it was when a man didn't know it was time to quit. But they were all looking at the wrong thing. They saw the tremor, but they didn't see the bandages hidden beneath his grease-stained sleeve. They didn't see the angry, blistering burns that wrapped around his forearm like a chain. They didn't understand that Arthur wasn't shaking because he was weak. He was shaking because he was the only thing holding back a disaster. Down in the dark, suffocating heat of the boiler room, Arthur wasn't just fixing a machine. He was wrestling a monster with his bare hands. And as the snow piled up outside and the accusations grew louder upstairs, Arthur knew he had to make a choice. Lose his dignity to keep the children warm, or let go, and let the cold take them all. What happens when the person you ridicule is the only one saving your life? The silence of Oak Creek Elementary was heavy, the kind of quiet that only settles over a school building after the last bus has pulled away. It was a vacuum of sound, amplified by the winter chill pressing against the frosted window panes. For Arthur, this silence was usually a companion. For 30 years, he had been the invisible current keeping this place running. He knew which floorboards creaked in the library, and which radiator in the cafeteria needed a gentle kick to start hissing. But tonight, the silence felt judgmental. It seemed to be holding its breath, watching him struggle. Arthur stood perched on the third rung of a fiberglass ladder, his breath forming thin clouds in the frigid air of the north wing hallway. Above him, a burnt-out light fixture waited. It should have been a simple task. Twist, pull, replace. He had done it 1,000 times before. But that was before the tremors started. He raised his right hand. It was a weathered hand, the skin mapped with the geography of decades of hard labor. Calluses upon calluses, scars from slipped wrenches and jagged metal. But now, it betrayed him. As he reached for the glass casing, his wrist jerked. It wasn't a violent motion, just a subtle, rhythmic spasm that he couldn't control. It was as if the nerves beneath his skin were firing in a panic, disconnected from his brain's command to simply hold still. "Steady, old man," he thought, biting the inside of his cheek. "Just hold it steady." He engaged his core, trying to will the shaking to stop. He could feel the sweat prickling on his forehead despite the cold. He gripped the new bulb, his fingers tightening. He was inches away, just a little closer. Then the spasm hit harder. His fingers didn't just tremble, they convulsed. The sleek glass bulb slipped from his grip. Time seemed to stretch, slowing down just enough for Arthur to watch his failure unfold. The bulb hit the linoleum floor not with a bang, but with a sharp, shattering pop that echoed down the empty corridor like a gunshot. Arthur flinched, closing his eyes. The sound of breaking glass was bad, but the silence that followed was worse. And then came the sound he dreaded most. Click, clack, click, clack, the distinctive rhythmic strike of expensive Italian leather shoes on the hard floor. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly calm. Arthur didn't need to turn around to know who it was. He could practically smell the expensive cologne, a scent that was too spicy, too aggressive for a place filled with crayons and floor wax. "That is the third one this week, Arthur." The voice was smooth, lacking any trace of anger, which made it infinitely more menacing. Braden, the new director of facilities, didn't believe in yelling. Yelling was for people who lost control. Braden preferred to dissect people with words, peeling back their dignity layer by layer. Arthur climbed down from the ladder, his knees popping audibly. He kept his head lowered, pulling a dustpan from his cart. He focused on the shards of glass, glittering like diamonds on the gray tile. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes," Arthur murmured, his voice raspy. "Slipped. My hands. Just a bit of a chill in the air today." Braden stepped closer. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed in a suit that cost more than Arthur made in 3 months. He stopped just at the edge of the broken glass, looking down at the janitor with a mixture of amusement and disgust. To Braden, Arthur wasn't a person. He was a malfunctioning piece of equipment, an eyesore in the modern, efficient machine Braden was trying to build. "A chill," Braden repeated, testing the word as if it tasted sour. "You know, Arthur, I've been looking at the budget. And then I look at the liability insurance. And then I look at you." Arthur froze, the broom trembling in his grip. He swept the glass into the pan, the scraping sound harsh and loud. "I'm fine, sir," Arthur said, a little more force in his voice this time. "Just an accident. Won't happen again." Braden crouched down, balancing on the balls of his feet so he was eye level with the stooped old man. His eyes were cold, devoid of any empathy. "It's painful to watch, Arthur," Braden whispered, his tone almost conspiratorial, as if he were sharing a secret. "You shaking like a leaf, trying to pretend you're still capable. We both know the truth, don't we? You're obsolete. You're a safety hazard walking on 2 legs." Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He wanted to scream that he knew this building better than the architects who designed it. He wanted to say that he was the one who came in at 4:10 a.m. to salt the sidewalk so the children wouldn't slip. But the tremor in his hand was undeniable. It was the evidence Braden needed. "I have a job to do," Arthur said quietly, standing up and dumping the glass into the trash bin. Braden stood up too, dusting off invisible lint from his jacket. "For now," Braden said, checking his watch. "But clean this mess up properly. If I find a single shard of glass when the parents arrive for the open house tomorrow, well, let's just say your retirement might come sooner than you planned." Braden turned and walked away, the clicking of his heels fading into the darkness of the hallway. Arthur stood alone under the empty light socket. He looked at his right hand. It was shaking violently now, fueled by adrenaline and shame. He grabbed his wrist with his other hand, squeezing tight, trying to crush the weakness out of his own body. But the shaking wouldn't stop. He wasn't shaking because of the cold. He was shaking because he knew Braden was right about one thing. He was holding on by a thread. And he had a secret reason, hidden deep in the basement of the school, why he could not, absolutely could not, afford to let that thread snap. The lunch bell rang, sending a stampede of sneakers squeaking against the polished floors above. But Arthur moved in the opposite direction. He navigated the narrow, dimly lit stairwell that led into the belly of the school. With every step downward, the air grew heavier, thicker, smelling of ancient dust, heating oil, and the metallic tang of old copper. The boiler room was a place most staff avoided. It was a cavernous, windowless dungeon filled with the labyrinthine groans of the school's heating system. But for Arthur, it was a sanctuary. It was the only place where the noise of the machinery was loud enough to drown out the ringing in his ears. He pushed open the heavy steel door. The heat hit him instantly, a dry, suffocating wave that contrasted sharply with the winter chill upstairs. In the center of the room sat the boiler, a massive, iron-bellied beast from the 1970s that hummed with a low, menacing vibration. Arthur wasn't alone. Tucked away in the far corner, wedged between a stack of surplus cafeteria chairs and a wall of fuse boxes, sat a small figure, Leo. The boy was 8 years old but looked 6. He had his knees pulled up to his chest, his face buried in a comic book that he wasn't actually reading. Leo was a frequent resident of the boiler room during lunch hour. The cafeteria, with its chaotic noise and unspoken social hierarchy, was a battlefield Leo had long ago surrendered. Here, amidst the machinery, he was safe from the boys, who thought shoving him into lockers was a sport. Arthur didn't announce his presence. He simply walked over to his workbench, pulled out a beaten-up thermos, and poured a cup of lukewarm tea. He placed a second, empty cup on the bench, an invitation. "They serving pizza today," Arthur said, his voice barely rising above the thrum of the boiler. "Smelled it from the hallway. You missing out, kid." Leo looked up, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "I'm not hungry." "Suit yourself." Arthur took a sip, his hand trembling so violently that the tea sloshed over the rim, scalding his thumb. He didn't flinch. He just set the cup down quickly, hiding the spill with his body. But Leo saw. The boy's eyes fixed on Arthur's hand, watching the way the fingers danced with that uncontrollable rhythmic jerk. "Does it hurt?" Leo asked softly. Arthur looked down at his hand, then back at the boy. He smiled, crinkling the deep lines around his eyes. "This? No. This isn't pain, Leo. It's vibration, like an engine that's running a little too fast. My mom says people shake when they're scared," Leo said, his voice honest and cutting. Arthur chuckled, a dry sound. "Well, your mom is smart, but this isn't fear." He walked over to the massive boiler. The pressure gauge on the side was twitching nervously, the needle creeping into the red zone. The metal casing groaned, a sound like a dying animal taking a breath. "You see this old girl?" Arthur patted the scorching metal flank of the furnace. "She's got a temper. She wants to quit. She wants to blow her top and let all the cold in. But someone has to hold her back. Someone has to keep the fire where it belongs." Arthur turned his back to Leo, shielding the boy from what he had to do next. The truth was, the boiler wasn't just old. It was broken. Critical seals had failed weeks ago. The automatic pressure release valve, the part Braden had refused to authorize a replacement for because it cost $2,000, was jammed shut. Arthur rolled up the sleeve of his gray uniform shirt. The skin of his forearm was a map of agony. Fresh, angry red burns layered over older, purpling bruises. The heat radiating from the pipes was intense enough to singe hair. But Arthur didn't pull away. He reached out and grabbed the manual override wheel. It was searing hot. His hand didn't just shake now, it spasmed as the nerves screamed in protest. The heat bit into his palm, searing the flesh. But Arthur clamped down. He had to manually wrestle the valve open to bleed the excess pressure, or the safety mechanisms would fail, and the heating for the entire east wing would die. Or worse, the pressure would blow a pipe in a classroom. He gritted his teeth, sweat stinging his eyes. The tremor in his arm traveled up to his shoulder, his entire body vibrating with the effort of holding the rusted metal steady against the immense force of the steam trying to escape. "Hold it," he told himself. "Just 30 seconds. Hold it for the kids." Behind him, Leo spoke up, oblivious to the torture Arthur was enduring. "You look like you're fighting it. Like a superhero holding up a collapsing building." Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear of pain leaking out, instantly drying in the heat. He forced his voice to remain steady, masking the strain. Something like that, Leo. Just wrestling the monster. With a final, agonizing twist, the valve groaned. A hiss of steam escaped into the vents, and the needle on the gauge began to drop back into the green. Arthur let go. He slumped against the workbench, cradling his throbbing, burned hand against his chest. He pulled his sleeve down quickly, hiding the angry red welts before turning back to the boy. He was breathless, his face pale, but he managed to wink. "See," Arthur said, his voice trembling just as much as his hands. "She just needed a firm hand. The monster's asleep for another day." Leo smiled, a genuine gap-toothed smile that lit up the gloom of the basement. He didn't see a broken old janitor. He saw a guardian. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a tube of cheap burn ointment he bought at the dollar store. He squeezed a dollop onto his palm under the table, the cool gel providing a momentary, blissful relief. He didn't do this for the paycheck. He didn't do it for Braden. He did it because he knew that upstairs, in those classrooms, there were hundreds of children who needed to be warmed to learn. He was the only thing standing between them and the freezing winter. And he would let his hand shake until it fell off before he let the cold win. But as he looked at the pressure gauge, Arthur knew something the boy didn't. The needle was already starting to creep up again. The fix was temporary, and he was running out of strength. The Oak Creek Elementary atrium was designed to impress. It was a soaring space of glass and polished terrazzo, flooded with winter sunlight that made the floor shine like a frozen lake. Today, that stage was set for the annual open house, a critical pageant where potential donors and wealthy parents came to decide if the tuition was worth the prestige. Braden stood at the center of it all, a conductor leading an orchestra of affluence. He wore a navy suit that fit him like a second skin, his smile bright enough to rival the mid-morning sun. He wasn't just selling education, he was selling exclusivity. "And to your left," Braden gestured smoothly, addressing a cluster of parents who smelled of cashmere and old money. "You'll see our award-winning STEM lab. We believe that environment dictates performance. Clean lines, clean minds." The parents nodded in appreciation. Everything was pristine. Everything was under control. Then, the service door at the far end of the hallway swung open. Arthur emerged, dragging a heavy industrial trash bin behind him. He looked like a survivor from a shipwreck stumbling onto a manicured beach. His gray uniform was dark with sweat, clinging to his stooped frame. Smudges of black grease, battle scars from his recent war with the boiler, streaked his cheek and his forearms. Worse, the acrid, heavy scent of heating oil trailed behind him, cutting through the delicate floral perfumes of the guests like a blunt knife. He had tried to wait. He knew about the tour, but the trash from the cafeteria overflowed quickly on pizza day. And if he didn't move it now, the smell of old cheese would permeate the hallway. He kept his head down, eyes fixed on the floor, trying to make himself invisible. He just needed to cross 20 feet of hallway to reach the loading dock. Braden's smile didn't waver, but his eyes underwent a terrifying transformation. They sharpened, locking onto the old janitor with the precision of a hawk spotting a field mouse. This was a contamination of his perfect scene. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll excuse me for just a moment," Braden said, his voice dripping with apologetic charm. "Personnel matters." He broke away from the group and intercepted Arthur, positioning himself so his back was to the parents, blocking their view. To the observers, it looked like a responsible administrator addressing a staff member. Up close, the veneer of politeness vanished. "I thought I made it clear, Arthur," Braden hissed, his voice low and vibrating with disdain. "You are to be unseen." Arthur stopped, his hands gripping the handle of the trash bin so tight his knuckles turned white. The tremors were back, violent and unrelenting, fueled by the exhaustion of holding the valve downstairs. "The bins were full, sir," Arthur whispered, his voice dry. "I didn't want the smell to—" "You are the smell, Arthur." Braden cut him off. He looked at the grease on Arthur's shirt with genuine revulsion. "Look at you. You look like a vagrant. Do you have any idea how much these people are preparing to donate? And you waltz in here shaking like a leaf, smelling like a mechanic's rag." Arthur swallowed hard, the lump in his throat tasting of shame. He tried to maneuver the bin around Braden. "I'll be quick, I'll just—" As Arthur stepped forward to pass, Braden shifted his weight. It was a subtle movement, practiced and precise. He extended his polished shoe just an inch, right into Arthur's path. It wasn't a violent kick. It was something worse, a calculated disruption. Arthur's heavy work boot caught the edge of Braden's shoe. With his balance already compromised by the tremors and the weight of the bin, Arthur didn't stand a chance. He pitched forward. The crash was catastrophic. The heavy gray bin tipped, sending a cascade of paper plates, half-eaten pizza crusts, and empty milk cartons sprawling across the pristine terrazzo floor. Arthur fell hard amidst the refuse, his knees slamming against the stone. A gasp rippled through the crowd of parents. For a heartbeat, there was total silence. Arthur lay on his hands and knees, surrounded by garbage. The pain in his knees was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the heat rising in his face. He felt stripped naked, his dignity shattered on the floor for everyone to see. Braden stepped back, performing a masterful pantomime of shock. He dusted off his jacket, looking at the parents with a shake of his head that said, "See what I have to deal with?" "Oh, Arthur." Braden sighed loudly, his voice carrying to the back of the room. "Clumsy again? I told you to take it easy with that condition of yours." A few of the children on the tour giggled, a cruel, innocent sound that echoed in the high ceiling. A mother covered her mouth, whispering something to her husband about safety standards. Arthur tried to stand, but his right hand, the one he had burned on the valve, slipped on a smear of tomato sauce. He faltered, looking even more pathetic. I'm sorry," Arthur stammered, not daring to look up. He began frantically scooping the trash back into the bin with his trembling, grease-stained hands. From the edge of the hallway, near the library entrance, a small pair of eyes watched. Leo stood frozen, his knuckles gripping the strap of his backpack. He saw the grease on Arthur's face and knew it wasn't from being dirty. It was from fixing the heat so they wouldn't freeze. He saw the tremor and knew it wasn't weakness. It was the aftershock of strength. Leo wanted to scream. He wanted to run out there and tell the man in the suit that he was a liar. But fear is a heavy anchor for an 8-year-old. Leo stood rooted to the spot, his heart breaking as he watched his hero crawling on the floor, picking up other people's garbage while the villain stood above him, spotless and smiling. "Leave it, Arthur," Braden commanded, signaling for a younger custodian who had just appeared. "Go home, before you break something else." Arthur stood up slowly. He didn't argue. He couldn't. He turned and walked toward the exit, his limp more pronounced than usual, leaving the mess behind him. As he pushed through the glass doors into the cold afternoon air, he didn't look back, but he could feel Braden's gaze burning into his back, erasing him from the world he had spent his life protecting. Most people looked at the scene in the atrium and saw a clumsy old man making a mess. But Sarah saw the foot. She was sitting on a hard wooden bench near the main entrance, wrapped in a gray wool coat that had seen better decades. with her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun and a canvas tote bag resting at her feet. She looked like any other grandmother waiting to pick up a child, invisible, harmless, part of the background furniture. While the wealthy parents in the tour group were busy admiring the vaulted ceilings, Sarah's eyes had been fixed on the floor level. She had spent 40 years in structural engineering before retiring. She noticed foundations, stress points, and the things people tried to hide. She had seen Braden's polished shoes slide out. She had seen the deliberate shift of weight. And she had seen the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes when Arthur hit the ground. As the crowd moved on, laughing softly at the interruption, Sarah didn't check her phone or smooth her skirt. She watched the janitor limp away toward the service elevator. Her expression remained impassive, but her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag until the leather groaned. She stood up. Instead of heading for the exit to wait for her grandson, she turned and followed the trail of dirty boot prints Arthur had left behind. She moved quietly, her sensible shoes making no sound on the tiles. She followed him past the cafeteria, past the gymnasium where sneakers chirped against varnish, and finally to the heavy steel door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." Arthur had left it slightly ajar. Sarah hesitated. The air leaking from the crack was thick and smelled of scorched metal. It was a smell she recognized, the scent of a system running too hot, pushing past its limits. She slipped through the gap, descending the concrete stairs into the gloom. The basement was a different world. The cheerful primary colors of the school upstairs were replaced by the stark gray of concrete and the rust orange of pipes. She found a spot in the shadows, behind a stack of air filters, and watched. Arthur was sitting at a workbench, his back to her. He had stripped off his work shirt, sitting in his undershirt in the stifling heat. His body was thin, the spine curved from years of looking down at floors. But it was his arms that drew Sarah's breath into a sharp halt. He was tending to his right arm. The flesh from his wrist to his elbow was an angry, mottled map of burns. Some were old and faded, but one was fresh and blistering, the mark from the valve he had wrestled earlier that day. He was trying to bandage it. Sarah watched, her heart twisting, as Arthur struggled. His left hand was steady enough, but when he tried to wrap the gauze, his right arm jerked uncontrollably. The tremor was violent, like a live wire thrashing on the pavement. He dropped the roll of tape. He picked it up. He dropped it again. He let out a sound, not a cry, but a low, frustrated grunt that echoed off the concrete walls. It was the sound of a man who was at war with his own body. Finally, he managed to pin the gauze with his teeth, using his good hand to wind the tape tight. He pulled it until the skin puckered, binding the burn, binding the weakness. Then, he stood up and walked over to the massive boiler. Sarah pressed herself deeper into the shadows. She expected him to kick it, to curse the machine that was causing him so much pain. Instead, Arthur placed his uninjured hand gently on the metal casing. He leaned his forehead against the hot surface, closing his eyes. "I know," he whispered, his voice raspy in the quiet room. "I know you're tired, old girl. I am too." He patted the machine, a tender, rhythmic thrumming against the steel. "Just hold on a little longer," he murmured. "They can't be cold upstairs. Not today. Just keep the fire inside, okay? Don't let it out." Sarah felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. She had come down here suspecting abuse of power by the manager. She hadn't expected to find a martyrdom. She realized then that the shaking she had seen upstairs wasn't from age, and it certainly wasn't from fear. It was neurological damage. The man was frying his own nervous system, day after day, absorbing the heat and the danger so the school could pretend everything was perfect. He wasn't a clumsy janitor. He was a human shield. Arthur pushed himself away from the boiler, wiping sweat from his eyes. He picked up his shirt and began the painful process of buttoning it over his bandages, preparing to go back up to a world that mocked him. Sarah stayed hidden until the heavy door clicked shut behind him. Only then did she step out into the light of the lone bulb. She walked to the boiler and looked at the pressure gauge. It was holding steady, but only just. She looked at the roll of tape left on the table, stained with a single drop of blood. She reached into her tote bag, but not for a phone or a wallet. She pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. She opened it to a fresh page, her pen hovering for a moment before she began to write. She wasn't just a grandmother waiting for a ride. And Braden Hayes had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He had assumed that because she was quiet, she wasn't watching. But Sarah had seen everything, and unlike Arthur, she had the power to make the world listen. The storm arrived overnight, burying the town of Oak Creek under 8 inches of heavy, wet snow. By morning, the wind was howling against the brick walls of the school, searching for any crack or crevice to let the freeze inside. Down in the basement, the battle was finally lost. It didn't happen with a bang or a dramatic explosion. It was a surrender. At 9:15 a.m., just as the second-grade class was settling into their reading circle, the massive iron beast in the cellar let out a long, shuddering sigh. The hum that had vibrated through the floorboards for decades simply ceased. Arthur was there when it happened. He was on his knees, his good hand gripping a wrench, his bad hand wrapped in layers of gauze that were already seeping through. He had been down there since 4 a.m., fighting to keep the pressure up, fighting to coax a little more life out of the dying heart of the building. But the metal was cold to the touch. The fire was out. He dropped the wrench. It clattered against the concrete, the sound echoing in the sudden, terrifying silence. Arthur slumped against the cold metal casing, his breath pluming in the air before him. He had failed. Upstairs, the reaction was slow but inevitable. The warmth drained from the classrooms like water from a cracked vessel. Teachers paused mid-sentence, rubbing their arms. Children began to zip up their hoodies. Within an hour, the ambient temperature in the hallways had dropped to 40 degrees. The intercom crackled to life, but it wasn't the principal's voice. It was Braden. Attention all students and staff. Please, proceed to the main auditorium immediately for an emergency assembly. Wear your coats. The auditorium was vast and drafty, the air inside biting and bitter. Hundreds of children shuffled in, their confused whispers creating a low hum of anxiety. They huddled together for warmth, their small breaths visible in the dim light. Braden stood center stage, illuminated by a single spotlight. He looked grave, serious, the very picture of a leader in crisis. But behind his back, his fingers were drumming a frantic rhythm against his clipboard. He knew the boiler failure would trigger an audit. He knew the missing maintenance funds, the money that was currently sitting in his personal bank account, would be discovered. Unless he had a scapegoat, unless the failure wasn't mechanical, but human. He signaled to the wings. 2 security guards escorted Arthur onto the stage. The janitor didn't look like a villain. He looked like a ghost. He was shivering violently, not just from the cold, but from the exhaustion that had hollowed him out. His uniform was stained, his hair wild, and his right hand was cradled against his chest, wrapped in dirty bandages. Braden stepped to the microphone, his voice booming through the speakers. I want to apologize to every parent, teacher, and student. Braden began, his tone heavy with manufactured regret. We are in this freezing situation because of a catastrophic failure of negligence. He turned and pointed a manicured finger at Arthur. For months, I have tried to work with our head custodian. I have tried to overlook the signs, the trembling hands, the erratic behavior, the smell of alcohol on his breath. A gasp rippled through the teachers. Arthur's head snapped up. Alcohol? He hadn't touched a drink in 20 years. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat was so dry, only a croak came out. Braden didn't let him pause. He pressed the advantage. This man, Braden continued, his voice hardening, in a fit of drunken incompetence, disabled the safety valves on our heating system early this morning. He pushed the system until it broke, endangering every single life in this building. The accusation hung in the frozen air. The children looked at Arthur with wide, fearful eyes. They didn't see the man who retrieved their balls from the roof or unlocked their lockers when they forgot the combination. They saw what Braden wanted them to see. A shaking, dangerous old man who had taken away the warmth. It's not true, Arthur whispered. But without a microphone, his voice died at the edge of the stage. Effective immediately, Braden announced. Arthur is relieved of his duties. We will be pressing charges for criminal negligence and property damage. Braden walked over to Arthur, leaning in close so only the janitor could hear, away from the microphone. Don't fight it, old man, he murmured, a viper's smile touching his lips. Look at you. You're shaking apart. Who are they going to believe? The man in the suit, or the cripple who can't even hold a broom? Arthur looked out at the sea of faces. He saw the judgment. He saw the fear. His right hand throbbed with a pulse of agony that nearly brought him to his knees. He felt small. He felt the weight of 30 years of service dissolving into nothingness. He lowered his head, the fight draining out of him along with the heat. He was just a tired old man with a broken body. Maybe Braden was right. Maybe he was useless. But in the third row, a small boy stood up. Leo didn't check with his teacher. He didn't ask for permission. He stood up on his chair, clutching a cracked smartphone in his hand, his breath hitching in his chest. He saw his friend up there, looking like he was about to break into pieces. And from the back of the room, near the exit doors, Sarah buttoned her gray wool coat. She didn't look at the stage. She looked at the faces of the board members sitting in the front row. She adjusted her glasses, her hand reaching into her tote bag to grip the notebook. The silence in the room was heavy, but it was about to be shattered. The ice was thick, but it was about to crack. He's lying. The voice was high and thin, cracking under the weight of terror, but in the cavernous silence of the auditorium, it sounded like a thunderclap. Braden froze, his hand halfway raised to signal the security guards. He squinted into the gloom of the audience. Sit down, son. This is an adult matter. But Leo didn't sit down. He scrambled over the back of the folding chair, his sneakers slipping on the polished wood floor. He ran down the center aisle, ignoring the hiss of his teacher trying to grab his arm. He was moving on pure instinct, driven by the kind of fierce, blinding loyalty that only an 8-year-old can possess. He didn't stop until he reached the stairs of the stage. He scrambled up, breathless, and threw himself between Braden and Arthur. He stood there, chest heaving, arms spread wide as if his small frame could shield the old man from the accusations. He didn't break it, Leo screamed, turning to face the confused sea of students and teachers. Tears were streaming down his face now, hot and angry. He held it. He held the monster so it wouldn't hurt us. Braden's patience evaporated. The scene was spiraling out of his control. "Security," he snapped, his voice sharp. "Remove this child. He's clearly hysterical." Two guards stepped forward, their heavy boots thudding against the stage floor. Arthur, rousing from his daze, tried to push Leo behind him, to protect the boy even now. "Leo, go," Arthur croaked. "Please, son, don't. Check his arm." Leo shrieked, batting away a guard's reaching hand. He pulled his phone from his pocket and held it up, though the screen was too small for the crowd to see. "I recorded it. I saw him. He held the hot pipe with his bare hands. He did it to keep us warm." Braden laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "A hot pipe? This is ridiculous. The man is a liability, not a hero. Get them both off my stage." "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Hayes." The new voice came from the back of the room. It wasn't loud, but it carried a steel core authority that stopped the security guards in their tracks. Heads turned. Down the center aisle walked Sarah. She had shed her gray wool coat, revealing a sharp blazer underneath. She didn't walk like a grandmother anymore. She walked like a force of nature. She marched straight to the stage, carrying her tote bag like a briefcase. As she passed the teachers, the principal, who had been sitting with his head in his hands, looked up. His face drained of color. He scrambled to his feet. "Mrs. Sterling?" the principal stammered. We weren't expecting the state inspector until next month." The whisper rippled through the faculty rows. "State inspector? The Department of Education?" Braden's smug expression faltered. He adjusted his tie, a nervous tic. "Inspector? Well, this is unexpected. As you can see, we are dealing with a personnel crisis. A drunken custodian who—" "Be quiet," Sarah said. She didn't shout. She didn't have to. She ascended the stairs, ignoring Braden entirely, and walked straight to Arthur. The old man looked at her, confusion clouding his eyes. He tried to hide his bandaged hand behind his back, the shame still burning hot. Sarah's expression softened. She reached out, her touch incredibly gentle, and took Arthur's right arm. He flinched, pulling back. "It's okay," she whispered, her eyes locking onto his. "Let them see, Arthur. Let them see what you gave for them." She turned him toward the audience. With slow, deliberate movements, she began to unwind the dirty, grease-stained gauze. Braden stepped forward, panic rising in his chest. "Now wait a minute. You can't just... That's a violation of privacy. You can't..." "I said be quiet," Sarah commanded, her voice cutting like a whip. She pulled away the final layer of bandage. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Even the children in the back rows could see it. Arthur's arm wasn't just injured, it was destroyed. The flesh was raw, blistered, and angry red, a horrifying testament to the intense heat he had endured. It was the hand of a man who had reached into a fire and refused to let go. "This," Sarah announced, her voice trembling with suppressed rage, "is not the hand of a drunkard. This is the hand of a man who held a manual override valve open for 3 hours straight because the automatic system failed." She reached into her bag and pulled out the black notebook, slamming it against the podium. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "And the system failed," she continued, turning her glare on Braden, "because the funds allocated for its repair 3 months ago were diverted. I've been tracking the accounts, Mr. Hayes. I know about the consulting fees. I know about the falsified safety reports." Braden opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at the parents, at the teachers, at the police officer who was now slowly walking down the aisle toward the stage. The narrative he had built, The story of the clumsy, incompetent janitor had crumbled into dust. Sarah turned back to the audience. She placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. He was weeping now, silent tears tracking through the grime on his face, not from pain, but from the sudden, overwhelming release of being believed. "You called him a safety hazard," Sarah said to the room, her voice breaking slightly. "But look closely. This man is the only reason this school is still standing. While you sat in your offices, he was burning to keep you safe." For a second, there was silence. Then, Leo started to clap. It was a small, lonely sound at first. Smack, smack, smack. Then a teacher stood up and joined in. Then another. Then the students. The applause swelled, growing louder and louder, rolling over the stage like a wave. It wasn't polite applause. It was a roar of gratitude and apology. Braden stood alone on the side of the stage, shrinking into his expensive suit as the police officer stepped onto the platform and unclipped a pair of handcuffs from his belt. But nobody was looking at Braden anymore. Every eye was fixed on the trembling old man in the dirty uniform, who was finally, after 30 years of invisibility, being seen. The chaos of the morning eventually receded, leaving behind a silence that felt fundamentally different from the one that had haunted the hallways just hours before. This was not the silence of fear or neglect. It was the hush of a fever breaking, a collective exhale of relief. Outside, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruiser reflected against the snowbanks, painting the white world in stark, alternating colors. Braden Hayes sat in the back of the vehicle, his head bowed, the expensive suit now looking like a costume he had no business wearing. As the car pulled away, tires crunching over the packed ice, he took with him the cold toxicity that had permeated the school. Inside the nurse's office, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and warm tea. Arthur sat on the edge of the examination cot. For the first time in years, he wasn't rushing to fix a leak or hiding in the shadows. He was simply sitting. A paramedic, a young woman with gentle hands, was finishing the dressing on his arm. She worked with a reverence that made Arthur uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being the one served. "The nerve damage is severe, Arthur," the paramedic said softly, taping the final piece of gauze. "But with rest and proper treatment, the pain will become manageable. You have to rest, though. No more heavy lifting. No more heroics." Arthur looked at his hand. It was encased in white, clean and soft. It still trembled, a subtle rhythmic vibration that would likely never leave him. But the angry red burns were covered. "I don't know how to do nothing," Arthur murmured, looking at his boots. "You'll learn," a voice said from the doorway. Sarah stood there. The fierce state inspector had softened back into the grandmotherly figure, though her eyes still held that sharp glint of intelligence. She walked into the room and placed a thick envelope on the metal tray beside him. "Braden is going to be facing a long list of charges," Sarah said, pulling up a chair. "Embezzlement, fraud, criminal negligence. But that doesn't undo the damage." She tapped the envelope. "The school board convened an emergency session 10 minutes ago. They authorized an immediate settlement. It covers your medical bills, Arthur, all of them. Plus the pension Braden tried to steal from you, and a significant amount for pain and suffering." Arthur stared at the envelope. It represented more money than he had seen in his entire life. "I didn't do it for the money, ma'am." "I know," Sarah smiled, and it was a genuine, warm expression. "That's exactly why you deserve it. You kept the heart of this building beating when everyone else was ready to let it freeze." She stood up, buttoning her coat. "Take a vacation, Arthur. Go somewhere warm. You've been cold for too long." As Sarah left, the door creaked open again. A small head peeked around the frame. Leo. The boy walked in slowly, stripped of his heavy winter coat, holding 2 juice boxes from the cafeteria. He walked up to the cot and sat down next to the old janitor, his legs swinging back and forth, not quite touching the floor. He didn't say anything at first. He just handed Arthur a juice box. Arthur took it with his left hand. "Thanks, partner." "The heaters are coming back on," Leo said quietly. "I can hear them clicking in the walls. The new repair guys are here." "Good." Arthur nodded. "They better treat the old girl right." "They said you're a legend." Leo looked up, his eyes wide behind his glasses. "The kids in my class. They said you're like the Iron Man of Oak Creek." Arthur chuckled, a rusty sound that felt good in his chest. "Iron rusts, Leo. I'm just an old man who didn't want you to catch a cold." Leo looked down at Arthur's right hand, resting on his knee. The tremors were still there, shaking the fresh bandages. Without a word, Leo reached out and placed his small, steady hand over Arthur's trembling one. He didn't try to stop the shaking. He just held it. He offered his own stillness as a counterweight to Arthur's chaos. Arthur looked at the small hand covering his own. He felt a lump rise in his throat, a swell of emotion that had nothing to do with the pain in his nerves. For 30 years, he had been the one holding everything together. He had gripped the tools, the valves, the secrets. He had carried the weight alone. But as he sat there in the quiet warmth of the nurse's office, feeling the small, firm grip of the boy who had saved him, Arthur finally let go. He let his shoulders drop. He let the breath leave his lungs. The shaking didn't stop, but for the first time, it didn't matter. He wasn't holding the world up by himself anymore. Outside the window, the gray clouds began to break apart. A single shaft of winter sunlight pierced through, hitting the snow and turning the white expanse into a field of diamonds. The storm had passed. The heat was returning. And the trembling guard at the gate could finally rest. Arthur's trembling hands held up the world for those children, proving that true strength isn't about how you look. It's about what you're willing to endure for others. Now, I want to hear from you. We've all known someone like Arthur, a person who works quietly in the background, doing the hard jobs, maybe getting overlooked or even judged. But who actually keeps everything running? Who is the unsung hero in your life? Or maybe you've been in Arthur's shoes, judged for a weakness that was actually a scar from your hard work. Take a moment and share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and this community needs to hear your voice. If this story touched your heart, please click that subscribe button and join our family. We tell stories here that remind us of what really matters. And don't go just yet. I've got another story waiting for you right here on the screen. It's about a stray dog everyone ignored, until one person looked closer and found a miracle. Click right there, and let's keep the inspiration going. I'll see you over there.